The letter arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a cream-colored envelope that looked far too elegant to contain a death sentence. It sat on the kitchen island, right next to my father's coffee mug, the ceramic chipped from 30 years of morning routines. The return address was embossed in gold foil, Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. I picked it up. The paper was heavy textured. It felt expensive. It felt like a threat wrapped in professionalism. Notice of final compliance and intent to lien. My eyes scanned the bolded text, the legal jargon designed to confuse and intimidate. They weren't just fining us anymore. They were invoking Clause 14, 9 of the Covenant. They were initiating proceedings to force the sale of the property due to persistent devaluation of community standards. In plain English, the HOA was trying to evict us from our own home. I looked up from the letter. The kitchen was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of my father, Frank, tinkering in the garage. He was 72 years old, a man who had built this house with his own hands in 1985. He had planted the oak tree in the front yard the same year my mother passed. He had wiped the dust off every single brick himself. And now a group of people in matching polo shirts decided his life's work wasn't good enough for them. I felt a cold hardness settle in my chest. It wasn't fear. It was something sharper, the kind of clarity you only get when someone pushes you too far. They thought we were weak. They thought because my father was older and because I lived 3 states away, we were easy targets. They thought this was a battle of paperwork. They were wrong. This wasn't just about a house. It was about dignity. It was about the last piece of ground my father owned in a world that was constantly trying to push him out. I folded the letter slowly, creasing the edge perfectly. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard. The grass was cut a little high. My father's knees weren't what they used to be. The paint on the fence was peeling slightly near the gate. To me, it looked like lived-in love. To the HOA, it looked like a violation. I turned back to the empty kitchen. I didn't wake my father. He didn't need to see this today. He had enough burdens. Instead, I pulled out my phone. I opened my contacts and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in 5 years. It was a real estate attorney in Chicago. Then I opened my banking app and checked my liquid assets. It was everything I had, my retirement fund, my investment portfolio, the savings I'd been hoarding for a house of my own. I stared at the screen. The numbers were significant, but were they enough? I looked back at the letter, intent to lien. "No," I whispered to the empty room, "you don't get to take this." I wasn't just going to fight this. I wasn't going to hire a lawyer and send cease and desist letters. That was the slow way. That was the way people like us lost, bleeding out slowly over months of legal fees while men like Gary Sterling, the HOA president, sat in their air-conditioned offices smiling. I needed a checkmate. I needed to change the board entirely. I made a decision right then, standing in the silence of my childhood home. I would buy the property next door, the vacant lot, Lot 45. It had been sitting there for years, overgrown with weeds and junk cars. The HOA wanted to turn it into a community park, which meant more foot traffic, more noise, and more reasons to inspect my father's property. If I bought it, I controlled the buffer. But buying it was just the start. I needed to make sure that once I owned it, the HOA could never touch us again. I put the letter in my pocket. I walked toward the garage door. I could hear the rhythmic clinking of my father's tools. He was humming a song my mother used to love. He had no idea that his world was crumbling around him. And he had no idea that I was about to start a war he didn't even know was happening. This is the story of how we took back what was ours. But it's not just my story, because as I would soon discover, I wasn't the only one planning a revenge. My father, Frank, was a man of few words and many secrets. That was the thing about men of his generation. They carried the weight of the world in their silence. When I moved back home temporarily to help him sort things out, I thought I was the protector. I thought I was the shark coming home to defend the reef. I was wrong. The first week back, I noticed things, small things, discrepancies in the routine. Every Thursday, my father drove into the city. He told me he was going to the library to read the papers. He loved the library. He said the silence helped him think. But I noticed he wasn't taking his reading glasses. He was taking his briefcase. The old leather one he only used for tax season. Then there were the phone calls. He would step out onto the back porch, lowering his voice to a murmur, shielding the phone with his hand even though I was inside the house. I caught fragments. Equity, liquidate, before the meeting. I tried to ask him about it one evening over dinner. We were eating steak, his favorite, but he was pushing the food around his plate. "Dad," I said, putting my fork down. "I saw the letter from the HOA. Sterling is escalating." My father didn't look up. He cut a piece of meat with precise, deliberate movements. "I know, Mark. We need to talk about what we're going to do. I've already called a lawyer. I think we should fight the fines." "No lawyers," he said sharply. The knife clinked against the plate. He finally looked at me. His eyes were blue, faded like old denim, but still sharp. "Lawyers eat time, and time is the one thing we don't have." "Then what do? They can't just force us out." "They can if we let them," he said. He stood up, taking his plate to the sink. "I have it under control. You focus on your job. You shouldn't have quit your firm just for this." "I didn't quit. I'm remote now. Dad, please let me help." "You are helping," he said, his back to me. He turned on the faucet. The water roared, drowning out the conversation. "By being here." That was the end of the discussion, but I wasn't going to let it go. 2 days later, I decided to follow him. I felt guilty about it, like I was betraying his trust, but the stakes were too high. If he was falling for a scam or if he was being coerced by Sterling, I needed to know. I waited until he left in his old Ford F-150. I gave him a 10-minute head start, then followed in my rental car. He didn't go to the library. He drove past the library. He drove past the downtown business district. He headed toward the industrial park on the edge of town, where the old warehouses were being converted into lofts. He pulled into the parking lot of a small, nondescript building. The sign out front was faded, Midwest Capital and Trust. I parked down the street and watched. He went inside. He was there for an hour. When he came out, he wasn't carrying his briefcase. He looked lighter somehow, physically lighter, like he had put down a heavy bag. He drove home. I waited, then circled back to the building. Through the glass window of the lobby, I saw a bulletin board with flyers for asset management, property acquisition, and private lending. My mind started racing. Why would my father be at a private lending firm? He hated debt. He paid off his mortgage in 10 years. He drove a truck that was 20 years old because it still runs. If he wasn't borrowing money, he was moving it. That night while he slept, I went into the garage and opened the locked toolbox where he kept his important documents. The combination was my mother's birthday. Inside, I found bank statements and a brochure for Lot 45, the vacant lot next door. There were handwritten notes, asking price, appraisal, Sterling's interest, and calculations showing he planned to liquidate his portfolio and sell his classic trucks to raise the money. He was selling the trucks, his 67 Chevy, 72 Ford, and 80 Dodge, the ones filled with memories of my mother and his life. I put everything back exactly as I found it and stood in the garage, surrounded by the smell of oil and old metal, feeling a crushing weight in my chest. He was trying to save the house by destroying the things he loved most. But he was thinking defensively. Sterling wasn't just after the park. He was a developer trying to force my father out so he could buy the house cheap and combine it with Lot 45 for a luxury duplex. My father was playing checkers. Sterling was playing chess. I couldn't let him sell his trucks. I couldn't let him spend his retirement on a lot that might not even stop Sterling. So I started digging into the HOA management company, Sterling Community Associates, looking for a real weakness. I would let my father continue his plan. I would let him think he was the only one fighting. Because if he knew I was risking everything too, he'd try to protect me. And this time, I needed to be the one protecting him. While my father was secretly meeting with bankers and preparing to sell his beloved trucks, I was executing a completely different strategy. I reached out to Alina, a contact from my finance days who specialized in distressed community associations. We met for coffee 3 towns over. I told her I wanted to know who held the mortgage on the HOA's common facilities. She quickly uncovered something much bigger. Gary Sterling owned the vacant land, including Lot 45, through a shell corporation. He was using his position as HOA president to find my father, devalue the property, and set himself up to develop the land once we were gone. The kill switch was the debt on Sterling's land holding company. The outstanding note was about $200,000. I could buy it for around $160,000 at a discount. If I controlled the debt, I controlled the collateral and the voting rights attached to the undeveloped land, which gave majority control over zoning and board decisions. I set up an anonymous LLC and had Alina handle the paperwork. I transferred the funds. I was now the primary creditor, but I had to stall my father. I had to watch him polish the trucks for sale, check his bank account with worry, and look more defeated each day. It was painful, but I couldn't risk tipping Sterling off before I was ready. The HOA escalated. Notices about the grass, the fence, demands that my father fix everything while his health visibly declined. I wanted to help, but I waited for the right moment. That moment came at the HOA board meeting the following Thursday. Sterling had called a special session to accelerate the eviction proceedings against my father. Thursday evening, the community clubhouse was packed. 30 homeowners sat under fluorescent lights as Sterling stood at the front in a navy blazer, projecting renderings of his planned community park. My father, wearing his old suit, sat in the front row looking like a soldier. I sat beside him with a briefcase on my lap containing the debt documents. Sterling called the meeting to order and quickly moved to enforce Covenant 14, 9 against my father. My father stood and offered to purchase Lot 45, but Sterling smiled coldly and revealed new bylaws that blocked the sale, claiming the land was for community use only. He was about to push through the LIEN when I stood up. "Mr. Sterling," I said, "before you vote, there's a matter of debt ownership regarding Oak Creek Land Holdings, LLC. I walked to the front and handed him the documents. I bought the note, which means I now control Lot 45 and hold 51% of the voting rights for zoning changes. I moved to dissolve the current board due to your clear conflict of interest." The room went silent. Sterling turned pale, but then my father stood up. "I also have a document," he said quietly. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "I bought the management company. I own the contract to hire and fire the HOA president." We both stared at each other in shock. He had bought the management rights through the trust company. I had bought the land debt. We had unknowingly attacked the same enemy from two different angles. Alina, who had been sitting in the back, stood and explained that under state law, the debt holder and management contract holder together could restructure the entire association. Sterling slumped in defeat. My father turned to him, his voice strong again. "Mr. Sterling, please pack your things. You're fired." Sterling tried to protest, but the homeowners began to clap. The power had shifted completely. We dissolved the current board on the spot and waived all fines against my father's property. After the meeting, as the applause died down, my father and I faced each other. "You bought the debt," he said. "You bought the management contract," I replied. "Why didn't you tell me?" We both asked at the same time. The tension broke and a few people chuckled. "I didn't want you to sell the trucks," I said. "I didn't want you to spend your savings," he said. We realized we had both been secretly trying to protect each other, lying to the other so we wouldn't worry. I told him I had already called the buyer and bought the '67 Chevy back. It was waiting in the garage. He admitted he had never actually sold his portfolio. He had forged the statement to keep me from interfering. We hugged tightly in front of everyone. Two men who loved each other too much to let the other carry the burden alone. We walked out into the cool night air and drove home in his old truck. The next morning, we had a choice. We could dissolve the HOA entirely and remove all rules, but my father shook his head. "Rules aren't bad," he said. "Sterling was the problem. We fix it. We keep the HOA, but change the bylaws to make it fair. No more evictions for cosmetic issues, no more conflicts of interest." We also decided to buy Lot 45 together and turn it into a community garden, not a sterile park, but a place where neighbors could grow things, just like my mother loved. 6 months later, Lot 45 was blooming with raised beds, flowers, and vegetables. The neighbors tended it together. The HOA had new, fairer bylaws. Sterling was gone, his lawsuit settled out of court. We refinanced the house together to repay my investment slowly. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the partnership we had built. I sat on the porch one evening watching my father in the garden, happily showing a neighbor how to prune tomatoes. He looked lighter, happier. The house wasn't perfect. The paint still peeled a little. The grass wasn't perfectly manicured, but it was ours and it was lived in with love. I learned that revenge isn't about hurting the other person. It's about protecting what you love. And the biggest lesson was about my father. I thought I had to save him, but he had been fighting just as hard for me. We weren't just father and son anymore. We were allies. The original HOA letter still sits in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of the day we stopped running and stood together. My father walked up the steps, wiped his hands on his jeans, and sat beside me. "Good harvest this year," he said. "Yeah," I said, "it is." He looked at the sunset. "I was angry when I found out what you did, but I was proud, mostly." He bumped his shoulder against mine. We sat there watching the sun go down over Oak Creek, the lights of the houses flickering on, life moving forward. We had won. But more importantly, we had found each other, and that was worth more than any property deed. If you're dealing with something similar, remember, you are not alone. Bureaucracy relies on your silence and isolation. Talk to your family, look for the loopholes, understand the rules better than those who enforce them. Never underestimate the power of a father and son working together. The HOA tried to evict us. Instead, they woke up a storm. And now we own the ground they stood on. Stay strong, stay smart, and protect your home.